Sarah, there you go. You were on mute.
Okay, sorry about that. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. Thank you, Dr. Shagan, for that introduction. Thank you, Pat, for sharing this panel with me. It's a real honor to be in such esteemed company and for such an incredible group of colleagues to be curious about my path up to this point. I also see a lot of peers and colleagues in our and co-champions of our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work at Hartford Healthcare on the Zoom here today. So thank you all for all of the great work that you've been advancing in your respective spaces. I'm happy to share a bit about my journey and what brought me here, and also some of the questions about the journey that are still sort of unanswered for me. And I look forward to hearing your questions and pieces of this that resonate, and also pieces of your stories that I can learn from. So as Dr. Shagan mentioned, I moved here from New York about 2.5 years ago, and Pat is sort of one of my heroes in the sense that she built something here, and I've been trying to build something here since I arrived. And it takes a lot of work. It takes being able to speak to a lot of different people in a lot of different settings, and leveraging all of the experience that I've had up to this point to be successful and to hopefully make some progress here. The sort of through line of my career and my personal life has just been sort of the blend of being of service and leaning really hard into storytelling. And that has taken the shape of me, studying human biology in college in order to better understand the human condition and the way that we treat people from a medical and behavioral health perspective, and also understanding the lives of the people affected by the policies that we create as organizations, as institutions, as countries, as communities, and weaving those things together constantly to sort of look for new avenues to positively advocate on behalf of other people. I got that sort of sense of public service from the family that I grew up in. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and my family has been there for many generations. I grew up with the sense of needing to sort of carry forward some sort of professional contribution, not just accomplishment and success, but contributions to a lot of public service in my family's history, and a lot of women doing remarkable things as well. I'm sort of very fortunate that I was raised by women who did really extraordinary things with their lives as professionals, and also as community members and parents and grandparents and aunts. And in some ways, that was sort of easier for me to imagine than it was easier for me to imagine, for instance, having a work-life balance, because I saw the sort of excellence with which my mother carried herself. My mother was an appellate litigator in Detroit. I saw the excellence with which my grandmother, who had a master's degree in library science, carried herself and dedicated herself to her community, her family, and then kept working throughout other iterations of her life when it made sense, given my grandfather's career. And so, having the expectation of sort of doing well and succeeding through others, there was definitely a lot of pressure that I put on myself and that experience through my family. But my family really comes from the sort of legal side of the employment spectrum. So I was one of the first to sort of look at healthcare. And I think it is because, for me, there's so many stories bound up in why we sort of how we relate to our bodies and our own sense of well-being. And it's just really interesting to me to see how those stories bring people together to heal or to connect, to get better. And so that's why I felt comfortable sort of striking my own path and not going in the direction that my family had gone in. throughout all of this, the thing that one of the things that I sort of still inquire about to myself today, and maybe others on the call can relate, is just the sort of ever-changing nature of one's identity when it comes to identifying as a change maker and what is required in order to do that. I ended up going to schools. I started my sort of preschool life in Detroit in the public schools, but for most of my education, my parents sent me to private schools in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, which is predominantly white, extraordinarily wealthy, and typically very conservative area, because my parents were not satisfied with the public schools in Detroit. They'd gone there themselves, but they thought they deteriorated. And as a result, I think I've learned a lot of the skills that have gotten me where I am now in my career. Spending a lot of time in predominantly white institutions, understanding what it takes to get a point across in an organization that, or an institution that just sort of takes certain white privileges and white supremacist notions as given, and doesn't necessarily challenge them. Gives you a certain number of tools in your toolbox to make change and speak truth to power. At the same time, I have to always ask myself, what is lost by picking up those traits and picking up the capability to carry that out, and developing that sort of third fluency, being able to speak white privilege, so to speak. But it has helped, and it's helped me move through a lot of different spaces throughout my career. And so I constantly ask myself, especially as a mentor and somebody who mentors and sponsors other young people of color, particularly Black women and men, how much assimilation should we really expect of the people who are coming up behind us and who are learning along with us? Can we, over time, expect that assimilation will be less of the process, and that what they bring authentically doesn't need to be polished or reshaped in order for them to belong in or contribute to a predominantly white space, or a space that's not defined by the experiences of historically marginalized communities. So something that I bring a lot of curiosity to. So sort of moving forward throughout that's sort of like the foundational experience personally for me growing up. I was a very, very studious kid, and so was able to get into an amazing university for school, and was also really fortunate to be able to follow that up with work in the public sector in New York, which is what I really wanted to do at the time. I cared a lot about healthcare, and I wanted to understand all of the different ways that sort of stakeholders are engaged to influence the way that health outcomes can be changed and improved over time. And it really wasn't until I spent 5 years or so in state government in New York that I fully developed the diversity, equity, and inclusion component of my work. That was through the sort of mentorship and sponsorship of a boss of mine. I was working for the National Urban Fellows, and the executive director of that organization at the time was and continues to be one of my champions. And we got to collaborate on some really exciting work around looking at opportunities to diversify the leadership of nonprofit organizations, foundations, organizations that really do speak on behalf of and support the well-being of historically marginalized communities, but whose leadership did not represent those communities they were trying to benefit. And that was when I really got my first taste of what it was like of how hard it is to move the needle when it comes to DEI. And even with executive leadership, sometimes there are sort of entrenched forces and historical norms that can prevent us from seeing the progress that we want to see. That said, every single opportunity that I've had to sort of learn alongside leaders who inspire me and who are not afraid to challenge thinking and challenge norms, I've tried to take it. I think of myself who has in her arsenal quite a few tools at the ready, because I have sat in observance of and in service of the mission of people who really inspire me. And as a result, I've been able to sort of pick up their traits and their tactics in order to achieve what I'm trying to achieve. So the lesson there for me is to always listen, to always observe. It's not about what I say in the meeting necessarily, it's what I can learn from that in order to continue being a better participant or contributor in whatever I'm doing. So just being mindful of time. The progression for me was through my DEI work and my government work, and then back into healthcare. I sort of spent some time after grad school working with the Greater New York Hospital Association, and again, looking at stakeholder engagement, looking at the ways that hospital associations and hospitals themselves and healthcare providers were responding to a very different landscape, sort of post-Affordable Care Act, and also really thinking seriously about the responsibility that healthcare organizations have when it comes to health equity. You know, when I came out of undergrad, there were no health equity departments in hospitals. And if I wanted to do health equity, I would have had to go to the CDC or like go to a government agency or go to a public health department. And it's incredible now how much focus there is on this topic within healthcare institutions. And so I find it extremely heartening that we've come this far, while acknowledging that we have so much farther to go. And as a woman in leadership now and building something so near and dear to my heart and so incredibly urgent for the people that we serve, I carry my identity as a Black woman very, it's just, you know, very constant for me, and also my identity as a mother. As Dr. Shagan mentioned, I have twins. They'll turn 5 at the end of January, and my experience of leadership and my experience of leadership, particularly during this pandemic, has been shaped by my identity as a Black person and my identity as a parent of young children very, very deeply. And just the last 6 weeks until they can get vaccinated is actually one of the most excruciating times of my life, especially as these case rates go up. And my daughter just got out of a quarantine, and the sort of terror of knowing that your kids are still so vulnerable, and that we're still figuring out, I think, as a country, how to integrate parents of young kids into senior leadership positions in a sustainable way. So I think about that a lot. So I hope that has been useful and enough fodder to get a good conversation going. And I guess with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Pat for her experience.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you for your comments about my building of the BHN. It took a lot of hands-on to do that, but I'm really happy as I leave at where we are, and I think it'll continue going forward. My story is actually a little different from Sarah's. And I just wanted to share one thing. Don't ask me why, in my kitchen the other day, looking out at the lake. We live on a lake, and I had this thought of, oh, you were just always in the right place at the right time. And that's how your career evolved. And I had to say to myself, no, that wasn't necessarily true, that I had to take some risks and I had to think about what I wanted to do. And it wasn't always about just being in the right place at the right time. But I tell you that to illustrate what I find, and I'm older than Sarah by far, and many of you, and I find the internal voice of the woman to sometimes be the voice that we hear that tells us we're not doing as much as we should, we're not doing what we should be doing. And certainly as a single working mother for much of my life, that was very true. I didn't grow up in a family where there was a lot of service orientation. My father was a fairly successful businessman, and my mother, interestingly enough, when I got to be old enough, went back to work and worked as a unit secretary in intensive care because she was bored. And so when I said that I, like many nurses, have no idea when I decided to be a nurse. It was just always there. And when I told my parents I wanted to be a nurse, they were vehemently opposed. My mother felt like I would work too hard. I won't tell you what my father says about nurses, but suffice it to say, they didn't want me to go. I think that's part of the reason I landed at Skidmore College. I think my parents were thinking, if you're not familiar with Skidmore, it used to be a rather exclusive, expensive school. I don't know if it still is. And I think my parents honestly thought if they sent me there that I would find something else that I wanted to do. The nursing program, however, was 1-2-1, 1 year in Saratoga Springs, 2 years in New York City, where I got my clinical training, and then back to Saratoga for my last year. And that's where I experienced psychiatric nursing for the first time. My first clinical rotation was at Bellevue Hospital. And I walked onto the psych unit and immediately fell in love with it. Just could not believe how much I loved being in that environment. What I remember is saying to the instructor at the time, this is what I want to do. And she sort of said, slow down, don't make this decision right now, which I still remember as being a little bit off-putting. She was the psychiatric nurse in the group, and yet she was sort of saying, maybe you don't want to do this. So, and that's how I experienced it. I started working at the Institute in 1982, 400-bed hospital, long-term stay. Let me just tell you, if we got an admission once a week, we complained. We knew our patients extraordinarily well. I was head nurse on an all-male, very acute unit, Thompson 2 in those days. And literally there was a client that sometimes when we would come in, the nursing station windows were all the way up, and he would throw an ashtray at the nurse's station window. And we would all say, oh boy, it's going to be a tough day, because he was kind of the barometer. But I actually believe my recovery orientation got started sometime during that time. So Thompson 2 was a double locked unit. As many of you might remember, you had to go through several locked doors to get into the unit, but there was a courtyard outside that was fully enclosed so that we could take people outside. And after I'd been on the unit during the spring and summer of the second or third year, I suggested that we open the doors to the courtyard and just leave them open, so the patients could come and go as they wanted to, and we would have a staff member in the courtyard all the time. And much to my surprise, it was the clients, the patients at that time, who had a lot of trouble with that. They were not used to that kind of freedom. I remember one of them getting quite agitated and calling me things that I wouldn't repeat in the community meeting, because he somehow felt I was putting people at risk. So, but I remember that very distinctly and feeling very good about that. I loved my time at the Institute. I learned a lot. We were fortunate enough to go through a nursing shortage. That is when the Institute of Living actually partnered with St. Joseph College to develop the first Master's in Nursing program, and it was in psychiatry. And as we know, they now do all sorts of Master's in Nursing programs. And there were 8 of us that went through this first class, and it had its ups and its downs, but definitely expanded how I thought. And so I really do think graduate education is important in terms of expanding the way we think. In 1999, or probably 98, I was loaned, if you will, to Capital Region Mental Health Center to serve as their director of nursing, because they didn't have one. And so I got to know people there, and I had not known community psychiatry. I'd really known very little outside the walls of the Institute, and at that time, Elmcrest Hospital, which was our biggest competitor. And I went to this community agency and simply fell in love with it. I loved the idea that I was in a building where clients were all the time, that we could interact with clients in a very, very different way than you can in a hospital setting, and really work with them to give them the most autonomy that you can. So one of the things that we did when I first got there was that the agency actually took over for being the manager of many of these individuals' money. And I saw that as a real conflict. and a real setup for clinicians in terms of having to do that. And so that was one of the things that I started to change and continue to work on as I sort of rose the ranks in Demas, getting away from our staff and staff members having to manage people's finances in a way that I thought impacted negatively on the relationship. Capital Region, really probably one of my favorite jobs ever, maybe because I was only there for about 18 months. So, you know, the shine never wore off. And the commissioner at that time asked me to come up and work with him on some issues that were going on with Demas. And then a few years later, I became deputy and then commissioner. And that time was really when the recovery orientation towards patients was really solidified for me. And it also was the time when I became very involved politically because, you know, if deputy commissioner or commissioner, you're testifying in front of approps, you're talking with legislators. First of all, you've got to get yourself confirmed. So you have to go over and convince everyone that you should get the job, although actually that's not that difficult. But people look to you, the legislators in particular, look to you to say, do you really need this money? And the nice part about when I first was with Demas, who had an $800 million budget, the highest budgeted Department of Mental Health and Addictions by far in the country, by far. I was at a brand new commissioner at a commissioner's meeting, and I said to Michael Hoagie, who was the commissioner in Connecticut prior to going to Ohio and then New York, and the commissioner from New Jersey, that I had at that time a $600 million budget. And they laughed and said, I think you added a zero there. You can't, it must be 60 million. And I literally called my deputy and said, isn't it 600? And he said, yes, but nobody could believe it. And the nicest part about that was when the state had money, we would get grants from SAMHSA to do things like enhance our mobile crisis team or bring up a community support program. And if we could demonstrate that it was successful, we could go to the legislature and often get continued funding to continue those programs. That ended probably before I was commissioner, when the state got into a lot more fiscal issues. And, you know, the human services commissioners in the state, and actually a lot of the commissioners are women. And so I didn't feel like I was always fighting in a man's world. I felt like I got the respect that I needed. I felt like people listened to me. You know, as many of you know, Demas was the first responder to Sandy Hook. And so I spent a lot of time down there. But the first day as I was going down, I got a call from the chief of staff who said, do we want Dr. Phil to come in to help us? And I said, absolutely not. No, 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 because I knew what a fiasco that would become. And so they listened to me, which was really very good. It was obviously one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. Having to be with families. And I spent a lot of time with the teachers, actually. And there was one teacher in particular who was not there that day because she was out ill. And the woman who took her place was killed. And so she had an enormous amount of guilt. And so those were the kinds of things that we were dealing with, trying to get the teachers able to teach again in their classrooms. And it was not easy. We had a teacher who literally wanted a ladder outside of her window so that if the school got attacked again, she could get the kids out. There was another teacher who was just so traumatized herself that she wouldn't let the children use the bathrooms. And there were incidents where kids actually wet their pants, but it was her trauma. So I'm not being critical at all. But that was an experience that I will never forget. And yet I'm not unhappy that I was a part of it. I think it was an important experience in the state. And I think there were a lot of us that were involved. It wasn't just Demas, many, many others were involved. And it probably influenced my politics even more than I had ever thought. because I've got to be frank, I have no idea why we allow guns in this country. And I remember saying at the time that that happened, when it was clear that at the federal level, they really were not going to do too much about gun control. I remember saying to somebody, if we can have kindergartners and first graders killed, and that doesn't influence our gun policy, then I don't think anything ever will. And unfortunately, I think that is proven to be true. What's the most disturbing to me is that we now have these shootings in schools and they're fourth, fifth on the news. You know, people, we've become inured to them. When that happened, the president flew in, the governor was there within an hour. I mean, it was a major national event, as you know, and that has gone away, which I find really deeply, deeply disturbing. So when you're the commissioner, you cannot look for a job. You cannot apply for a job. There's really weird things in statutes when you're a commissioner that you would never know about. And so Steve Larson, actually my predecessor, called me and said he would like me to meet with Jeff Flax to see if I was interested in this role. I missed the first two interviews completely. I don't know if it was denial, if it was I think one was a scheduling snafu. The other one I just missed. And so Steve called me and said, you know, maybe you don't want the job, but you are the commissioner and he is in a position at a major, you know, hospital institution. Maybe you should just go meet with him. And I did. And I can tell you that within 45 minutes, Jeff had talked me into the job. And that was because I saw this way to build another system. I felt like Demas was doing well. It had done well. I felt like we reached a lot of milestones in terms of the recovery orientation. We developed the job descriptions for recovery support specialists, which took 2 years. And by the way, DAS the Department of Administrative Services had to approve that, and would approve it, but only for outpatient. They would not allow recovery support specialists to work at CVH or Whiting. That has changed since then, by the way, but that's how foreign the concept was to people. So I came here in 2015. We were all in a conference room, actually here at the IOL with Hank. And I said, well, you know, my job is to create a network to move this to the next level. And Hank, who I love dearly, said, well, that's a pipe dream. And it took a lot of work, right, to get people to understand that we were better off working together as entities than we were working alone and sometimes competing with each other. And sometimes we still do that. A little healthy competition is great. But we are really much better, and we're really good, in my opinion, now at sharing knowledge, at sharing experiences, at sharing patients. And so I feel good about where the network is. And this job also allowed me and encouraged me to continue to do the work that I do in the political realm. And that, to me, first of all, created some job satisfaction for me because I happen to love that work. But it also gave me an opportunity to reinforce that Hartford Healthcare was not just a big hospital system, but had many, many other things to offer to the community. And while I know this is sometimes a bone of contention for people, one of the best parts of my job is when somebody calls me who needs assistance. It's really hard to navigate our mental health system, and to be able to help somebody who is in need because their kid is in trouble, or their wife is having trouble, or their father is having trouble, and to be able to help them navigate the system, for me, gives me the most personal satisfaction. So I feel like I'm retiring at a good time. I feel really good about where the network is. I'm confident that John, who is completely as recovery oriented as I am, will continue that work with Jim. And I think that it will continue to grow. So I think, Dana, I'll stop there.
So thank you both for sharing a small piece. It's kind of hard to say, okay, describe your life in 15 minutes, but very impressive. So at this point, I can open things up for questions. There is one question in the chat, and then if folks would like to pose a question yourself, maybe do hand raising. So Janine, are you still here? Do you want to pose your question?
Sure. So both for Pat and for Sarah, all women come up against the male-oriented system, regardless of what position you're in or where you are. And I'm just wondering how you handle those kinds of situations when someone didn't take you seriously because of your gender. And then what advice do you have for other women on how to handle this? Oh, I see Karen Kangas is there. Wow. Hi, Karen.
I'm happy to start if that's okay, Sarah. I think you're right that we still live in a very white privileged male society. I think we're trying to make it better here at Hartford Healthcare. I will tell you one of the things that I hate the most that I do, and I've never been able to change it, but when I get really angry, I mean really angry, I start to cry. And I unfortunately have done that in some executive leadership meetings once here, and it's embarrassing, but usually it's out of frustration that people are not hearing, and often that's men, are not hearing what I'm trying to say. I do think the biggest weapon against that is to have the knowledge base. And one of the things I had to learn when I was commissioner to say to myself, especially when I was testifying, was, you know more about behavioral health than anybody else in this room. And that always helped me to get through either touchy questions or difficult situations. And again, remember, these were a bunch of politicians. These were not mental health workers who may have had more knowledge. But at some point, you also have to believe that your knowledge is significant enough so that people will listen to you. It's really about sort of exuding that confidence and saying, I know what I'm talking about, and not backing down.
Yeah, build on that. And I love that you mentioned that, Pat, that you let your anger out when it needs to, when it needs to come out, because it's a sign of your frustration and what you're ultimately looking to get across and accomplish. I have found that sort of on the flip side, sometimes men who don't really enjoy encountering women in leadership positions start to bristle and become somewhat reactive and sensitive very early in a conversation before anyone's gotten anywhere close to anything to like a negotiation, and that there's actually an emotionality that men can sometimes present, and sometimes women who don't like working with women in leadership positions, because we can all have some sort of like internalized misogyny, right? And so in those moments, it's as Pat mentioned, it's great to just sort of remind myself, why I'm here, my domain and subject matter expertise, and laying out the facts in some ways, like leaning into rationality and reason, which people say women don't have much of, but I find it to be quite to be a very shallow accusation. And I think women in leadership positions have to know 10 times as many tools to sort of navigate these waters, because we are sort of underestimated at times. I also think that it's I end up collaborating and socializing ideas and getting input on content that I'm looking to champion, maybe even more, because I have to think about, well, is this going to be discounted because it's coming from me, because I'm a woman, because I'm Black, because maybe I'm one of the younger people in the room. And I think that just makes my work stronger and more likely to get other people on board anyway. So it never hurts to be a good collaborator, and being able to sort of point to the other people in the room that say, I think this is a good idea as well, can help a lot.
Thank you.
Are there other questions we have a great opportunity here and a little bit of time. I can always come up with questions, but for folks who are on the call now, is there something in the conversation that sparked some curiosity from you?
Oh, Dana, go ahead, Rosemary, sorry.
That's okay. If either of you could, in any situation in your leadership career, if there is one thing you could have done differently, what would that have been? I know that's a pretty broad question, but anything from starting your career to kind of where you are now.
Boy, it sounds silly to say no, but I'm struggling to come up with something, actually. I guess maybe, and I was going to just touch on this briefly before you asked that, Rosemary, was the issue of parenting when you are, working this kind of job. And I was in administration when my children were quite young. I was fortunate enough to work at an institution, the IOL, where it wasn't unusual for us to bring our kids to work if they were sick. Clearly, I was not on an inpatient unit or in a program, but there was an acceptingness of that. And that was really, really helpful for me. But, there's a lot of guilt that goes along with being a working mother who works a lot of hours. And I remember a couple conversations with my daughter in particular, where once she said, "Oh my God, if you didn't work, you would be like so-and-so, this other mother, and you would be managing our lives." So, she kind of let me off the hook. She's now a new working mother, and boy, is she really struggling with it. So it is hard. When I was at the Institute, when we merged with Hartford Hospital, it was the first time we took Title 19, right? Because we were an IMD, we couldn't take it. And so I got called for every single Title 19 admission, no matter what time of day. That was just the way we set it up. And at some point, my 3-year-old son heard that, and it was a beeper in those days, had heard that beeper go off and threw it across the room and let me know exactly how he felt about me working that much. But I will say that both kids also have said repeatedly that it was good for them because they got to see not only that women can work and be very successful, but also I loved what I was doing. And so both of my kids very much wanted to find jobs, careers that they loved what they were doing, and they actually have. So I'm very happy about that. I don't know if that really answered your question.
Pat, as you're saying this, I am reminded that when I first joined the IOL, there was on-site daycare. And, I was really excited about that when I had my son or when I was expecting, and then they took it away. So as we talk about that work-life balance, that really hurt. I had plans. So, okay, mindful of time. There is a question in the chat. So Jacqueline, would you like to pose your question about pushing for change?
Sure. I was just wondering, how you knew, or was it someone or, a group of individuals that kind of made you feel comfortable with pushing for the change that you want to make versus, I worked for other.
Hello, this is Glenn. How may I help you? Hi, Liz.
I've worked for other corporations that say they want, innovative ideas and change makers and people to think outside the box, but then when you do, it's kind of almost frowned upon, or you're given some pushback. So I was just wondering what it was that made Hartford Healthcare different, or, BHN, for you to feel comfortable enough to do what you've done.
I think you have to have a strong group that supports you. So when I think about Deputy Commissioner, when we started really focusing on recovery orientation and working with groups of individuals with lived experience and funding the agencies that were those agencies, I had a very strong team that had the exact same philosophy. And if you have somebody on the team that doesn't have the same philosophy, sometimes, especially if you're in a senior leadership position, you have to make a decision that maybe that person isn't a good fit for the team. But, as I said earlier, John came just a couple of years after I was here, and I was extraordinarily clear, and he was that we shared the same values and the same commitment to the same forward movement. And again, if you have a team that supports you when people are pushing back in ways that begin to make you feel like you should give up, or this is a crazy idea, or we don't appreciate this, that you have other people that you can go to and talk with and get the reinforcement you need to stay on the path you're on. That's really critical, I think.
I think that's right. Building that team around you and embedding the right sort of resources in different parts of the organization so that your work speaks for itself, but it also speaks through others. And you sort of embed those change makers across the organization. And, I think it does sort of come down to an organizational ethos in a lot of ways. I came here because I knew that I had in Jeff Flax a sort of champion for the work that I wanted to do around health equity. And the promise there sort of goes both ways. Like the ways to get there is for him to let me, build stuff and also at times fail and make mistakes in figuring out the best way to get that done. And so some of it is also just constantly engaging the sort of natural change agent in the people that you're working with and who are closest to decision-making authority. And so, and making it as close as possible, the sort of pitch for the work as close as possible to our shared mission, so that the sort of point and the purpose becomes harder and harder to argue against. But it is a constant process because obviously many people are change averse and they worry about what's in it for me and what's going to happen to me. And so you have to sort of be ready to dig in and constantly be on that campaign, so to speak, in terms of making the work move forward.
Thank you both. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Cruz, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. There's been a lot of conversation in the field from thought leaders about leadership and about embracing concepts such as authenticity and to be courageous, that you have to dare to be vulnerable in your leadership. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that and the reality of both of your experiences in as leaders, and where there's historically this norm of an image of strength and confidence, and how, in reality, is there a balance that's struck? And also as a woman, do you have to be particularly mindful about those kinds of concepts? So just curious about your thoughts.
Start again, Sarah, if that's okay. I think if there's one thing that I have worried about over the years, and probably more so here in some ways than at the state, I'm not sure quite why, I'm extraordinarily transparent. I feel like sometimes I share a little bit too much. But in my experience, that transparency, that showing that vulnerability, sharing, especially with your leadership staff, what's going on, really helps earn people's trust. And also, I think when it helps people to see you as authentic. I think if you're hiding everything you're struggling with and you don't feel like you can talk about it with people in your leadership team, and I'm not talking about at the same level, I'm talking about I think about the whole leadership forum. You know, what can you say? And frankly, even with staff, I think that is one of the most important traits, if you will. It's not the right word, but it's one of the most important things that I feel like I bring to the table. I think it's just critical.
Yeah, my experience with this question my answer would have been different 5 years ago, would have been different 10 years before that. I've always been extremely aware of what how people might interpret my expressions of authenticity or vulnerability based on my race, based on my gender, based on my age. And so was much more, I would say, strategic about the level to which or the degree to which I would sort of share my lived experience at work. But that changed a lot. It started changing when I became a parent, and it changed significantly because of the pandemic. I just don't see the point of veneer at this point. And if someone does want to interpret whatever it is that's going on with me and cast it in a negative light because of my various intersectional identities, then in some way that's sort of not my business, and it's not for me to sort of get into their head around it. I know who I am, and I think that showing up authentically, being able to talk about, a kid being in quarantine or a husband being in quarantine or whatever it is important and valuable, and it's humanizing, and it is now very much a part of who I am as a leader. And so I'm in some ways, I'm not going to relinquish that as a result of the pandemic, if it ever ends, easing. So.
Thank you so much. It's incredibly inspiring to see women who have been successful, but continue to embrace those things and have the confidence of your beliefs. So thank you.
Yeah, I have to second. I really appreciate the authenticity that I've always experienced in working with each of you. It makes a big difference. So I know we're getting short on time, but there is a question in the chat, and Dr. Gavardian is not able to say it. So I'm going to read it for her, and then I invite your response. So she says, hi, I have a question, but I'm unable to unmute because I'm in a noisy area at the moment. To both, do you have any insights to share with young women or women in general who may feel discouraged as though the network is taking a giant step backwards by replacing the most visible woman in leadership with a white male?
It's a tough one. I think that we all know that we need more diversity, right? There is just no doubt about it. We don't look like the individuals that we're serving across the board, and that's difficult. I feel like I have been really, I guess, blessed as a woman who was able to start fairly young in leadership positions. There weren't a lot of nurses here in 1982. I was a staff nurse. I covered 3 units because there wasn't another nurse. It was very different time, obviously, different regulations. And so I was given a lot of opportunities early on, which certainly helped my trajectory. I don't really know I know what it could look like or what it may say to young women, and I'm sorry about that, actually. But I do think that at times an organization has to make a decision based on sort of the circumstances they find themselves in. And, Jim knows the operations inside and out. And this will be, I think it'll be a fairly seamless transition. And from my perspective, that's really important. Would I have liked to have seen another woman in this role? Yes, yeah, I think it's really critical, actually, especially at Hartford Healthcare, that we continue to promote women into very senior leadership roles and not sort of regress because of all the stress that the system finds itself under.
Thanks, Pat. And thanks for sharing your perspective on this. Excuse me. I think that in general, our team has been thinking about how we can more thoroughly integrate these sorts of perspectives, right, from our workforce, who are inspired by our organizational commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and more formally engage those voices, whether through our colleague resource groups or our DEI or DEIB councils, in the process of naming succession trajectories and bringing some more transparency to the whole process of what our sort of leadership flight plan looks like for this organization. I think we can do more with the resources that we have established, and that we then, as senior leaders, need to hold ourselves accountable to the ways that we're asking people to weigh in with their perspectives. So that's something that I would I'm interested in pursuing this year, and we have to live this value in every way possible, and we understand how critically the success of our organization relies on our people seeing themselves in leadership, sort of full stop. So more to come there, and I really appreciate the question.
Dana, can I give one last thought that I think is really critical for people? Don't manage up, manage down. And what I mean by that is we're all worried about what our bosses think of us, right? And that's important. But if you manage and support your staff and listen to your staff, figure out who your informal leaders are and listen to them and work with them, you will be successful because they will support you in a way that allows you to do your job at the higher level. And so don't manage up, manage down. That's it. Thanks, Dana.
One of what I would guess are many pearls of wisdom. So we have to wrap up this meeting, and thank you so much to Pat, to Sarah. This was really delightful, and I'm so glad that people were able to join us. So I hope to have other women's forum events, and I will certainly extend the invitation to people across the BHN. So stay tuned. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.